So the purpose of the law is to save lives. And the mind of the lawgiver is to save lives and to operate safely. So if your father-in-law is dying and has to go to the hospital immediately, and there's a 15-mile-an-hour speed limit, and it's 2 o'clock in the morning, and the road is completely free, you drive 100 miles an hour to the hospital. And you won't get a ticket, and you won't get punished by the government, because the mind of the lawgiver is the speed limit law is made for the purpose of saving lives and for the purpose of safety. And in order to save the life of your father-in-law, you've got to drive 100 miles an hour through a 15-mile-an-hour speed zone. Another time can happen is that there's a 15-mile-an-hour speed zone and a man is chasing you with a gun. And he's trying to kill you and trying to run you off the road with a semi-truck, and you're inside a little motorcycle. You need to drive 100 miles an hour through the 15-mile-an-hour speed zone in order to not be killed. And this is in the fulfillment of the wishes of the lawgiver. This law is called the law of Abakiah, because every law is made for the purpose of the common good, and every law is made for the purpose of the common good, the good of society and the good of the individuals. That's why laws are made, as well as, of course, the glory of God and the preservation of the divine order. So that now we have laws of the church. The laws of the church are human laws, and being human laws, they don't apply to every particular situation. The divine laws, God never leaves out a possibility. The divine laws cover everything. That includes even the divine natural law. You won't find a single case in nature where something decays and doesn't know where to go, where something is born and doesn't know how to grow, and so on. The laws of nature always work perfectly. Human laws don't always work perfectly, because even if they are under the power of God, they're not necessarily the laws that, they're not necessarily perfectly followed. They cannot be perfectly followed in every instance, because human beings can't foresee, including popes, including bishops, including kings, including legislators of any country or any organization. They cannot foresee every potential situation. Hence, there is a law which is included in every law called the law of Abakiah. What is the purpose of the laws of our Holy Mother, the Church? The glory of God, preservation of the faith given to us by our Lord Jesus Christ, and the common good of the salvation of souls. That's what the purpose of the law. And the principle of this law is the Suprema Lex Salus Animarum. It's the principle of this law. The supreme law is the salvation of souls. And the reason why the church makes laws of excommunication, laws of interdict, laws of going to Mass on Sunday, and what fulfills that law, being there for the minimum from the beginning of the offertory until the end of the communion, etc., going to confession once a year, and receiving Holy Communion during the Easter time worthily. All of these laws of the church, great and small, the laws concerning marriage, all the laws of the church are made for the church to help the salvation of souls, the glory of God firstly, fulfillment of His faith and precepts secondly, and then the salvation of souls. And it's all summarized in the salvation of souls. The Suprema Lex is the Salus Animarum. Now, what happens in a crisis in the church? In the crisis in the church, we have the faith being taken away by the authorities. So the authorities are not following the faith. The bishop is not following the faith, which is the first purpose of the law, to follow and preach the faith. He's not following and preaching it. The priests under his direction, they are also not following the teachings of the faith. They are not clearly expressing the faith to their flock. They are not clearly condemning the errors and heresies that lead their flock away from heaven. And then we add that greater scandal of another scandal of our period. They also have a new Mass. They also have a Mass which is sacrilegious and leads souls away from God. So they are not teaching the faith that is handed down by the apostles. They are not condemning the heresies which must be condemned in order for us to be pleasing to God. They are not giving working for the salvation of souls. In fact, they're using their authority in order to damn souls, forbidding the Latin Mass, forbidding the preaching of the Catholic faith and the Catholic truth, forbidding the clear profession of doctrine, forbidding souls from receiving the sacraments in the grave state of necessity, and so on. And therefore the authorities are using their authority for evil. What is the obligation of a priest? What is the obligation of the faithful? And it is well said here by Father Cummins, this book at J.V.B. was about Father Cummins, one of the many great traditional priests. And here you have your Mass in Streaky Bay because of Father Cummins. And he said he was a Redemptorist priest, and he said the same thing that my pastor said. Father Cummins was born in 1915. My pastor was born in 1912, so there's 3 years difference in age. And the same thing my pastor said, born in 1912, and Father Hannafin, and here Father Cummins, the same thinking. Father John Quinn, another priest, born in around 1915 or so, and ordained a priest also in 1945. All three of them were ordained in 1945. And so that these priests, two of them I was raised around, and many other priests besides, never met Father Cummins. But notice in the Father Cummins here in Australia, Father Cummins, a Redemptorist priest, same teaching, same practice of the priest that raised me in America. And the same teaching, same practice, the priest in France. Same teaching, same practice as the priests throughout the world who stood for the Catholic tradition and would not bow down to the errors and heresies of Vatican II. Father Cummins describes very well how it is and why it is that he goes around to say the Mass without the permission of local bishops. We must understand as regard to the authority of the bishops. They have authority from God. And that authority comes from Christ himself. The Pope designates the diocese of a bishop, but the authority actually comes from Christ directly to the bishop. The Pope administrates that power. The Pope can take away that power, but the power actually comes from Christ himself, as he said to the 12 apostles, a similar promise that he made to St. Peter in chapter 18, verse 18 of the Gospel of St. Matthew. He spoke to all the apostles. And so we have Christ here gave power to the apostles. The apostles, the bishops are the successors of the apostles. And the bishops have authority from God over the area designated to them. So a diocese, for instance, say the diocese of, what is it? Port Pirie, is that right? Port Pirie diocese that we're in here. It is an area, it's quite large. And in that Port Pirie diocese, every single Catholic in that diocese is under the jurisdiction of the bishop. There can be no masses in that diocese. There can be no preaching of sermons in that diocese. There can be no hearing of confessions in that diocese without being under the bishop of Port Pirie. And the same is true in every diocese throughout the world. The bishop's authority is not only in his physical buildings that he built. So he built a church here, and a church there, another church here, a school here. His authority is over every Catholic who even passes through his diocese. I remember Father Hannafin telling me when he was newly ordained, he got on the train in Louisville, Kentucky, and he was on his way back to Connecticut to visit his home. And this man said to him, "Father, can you hear my confession?" In 1945, you had to get the permission from the bishop of each diocese you were in. And he said, "We're about to cross the Ohio River. When we cross the Ohio River, we're going to be in another diocese. You better speak fast." And so you want to go to confession, start right away and finish before we hit that river. Because our train is going to cross the river. And if we cross the river before you finish your confession, I can't absolve you. So they did a speedy confession. And before the train crossed the river, and it mattered because in Kentucky, in many states, the border is in the middle of the river. But since Kentucky is an older state, all the way to the north part of the river equals the place of the jurisdiction. So Father was absolving him and looking out the window, making sure that he finished the absolution before they crossed the river. Because the bishop has authority not only in the church, but in the entirety of the diocese. And no Catholic priest, no Catholic other bishop who visits the diocese can rule in that diocese. It's something like the captain of a ship. Even the admiral, when he is on the ship, he obeys the captain. He runs the entire navy, but the captain runs the ship. He tells the captain where to take the ship. He doesn't tell the captain how to run the ship. And so the captain runs the ship, and the bishop is like the captain of the diocese. So every priest in the 1960s and 70s. And all of them were saying, you are saying Mass without permission in this person's house. You're saying Mass without permission in this funeral home. You're saying Mass without permission inside of this hotel, etc. You don't have the right to do that because the bishop forbids all the Latin Masses in every hotel and every private home. And in fact, he has the right to forbid a priest from saying Mass in a private home, provided he is following the law of God and the law of the church. Here we must remember there are two parts of justice. There's commutative justice, which all superiors know very well, and there's distributive justice, which is very, very fuzzy in our books. Commutative justice, the justice of equals, by which I am obliged, I give you $100, you give me a car. You give me a Coca-Cola or a Starbucks cup of coffee for $100. I give you $100, you give me the cup of coffee. Now the fact is, this is commutative justice. Also towards superiors, by which we obey our superiors. But there's also distributive justice. That's the obligation of the superior to the inferior. The obligation, superiors have obligations of justice towards their inferiors. They do not have the arbitrary power of a tyrant or the arbitrary power of God. They have obligations of justice. These obligations of justice are mentioned in the Code of Canon Law, well quoted here by Father Cummins and by many other priests, that the obligations of justice by which a superior is obliged to distribute to his flock. The chief obligation of justice is actually described by our Lord Jesus Christ when he gave an obligation of justice to Simon Peter about 15 days after the resurrection, when Peter went on a fishing trip. When Peter came back from his fishing trip, he swam to the shore, he ate fish with our Lord Jesus Christ, and then our Lord Jesus Christ said, Simon, son of John, lovest thou me? Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. And he gave him an obligation of justice. Feed my lambs. In order that there be no confusion, he repeated the obligation of justice. Feed my lambs. And to make it abundantly clear, he repeated it a third time, feed my sheep. Why is a shepherd a shepherd? He has an obligation towards his sheep. He has an obligation to feed his sheep. He has an obligation to defend his sheep from the attacks of the enemy. He has an obligation to take the wayward sheep that have wandered away from the fold and bring them back. He has an obligation to seek after the lost sheep. These are not the requests of our Lord Jesus Christ. In Ezekiel chapter 34, he speaks about the wicked shepherds. And he says, you have driven the sheep off of the land. You have shorn them in the wintertime. You have been most wicked shepherds. You have not fed the sheep. Therefore I will require every lost sheep, every one I will make you pay. And then he prophesies in that chapter, and I will send a good shepherd. And they learned from this, the Jews, that one day when the Messiah would come, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, when the priest, according to the order of Melchizedek, would finally come, he would be a good shepherd. And he would call himself a good shepherd, which he did in the Gospel of St. John chapter 10. He said, I am the good shepherd, the one spoken of by the prophet Ezekiel 600 years before I was born. I am the good shepherd, and I know mine, and mine know me. And there are many sheep I have that are not of this fold, but they must be brought together, that there be one fold and one shepherd. So he knows his sheep. The shepherd is a shepherd. He is not a disciple of the people. He is a carrier of the kingdom of Christ. He has obligations of justice. This means the faithful have rights. Rights which the modern bishops reject. And these rights are contained in the law of the church. That even though you are the inferior and you should obey the priests, you are the inferior and you cannot command the priests, you cannot command the bishops, you cannot command the pope. But though it is true that you are the inferior and you cannot command, you can demand. You can demand. What do you have the right to demand? And here is quoted several times by Father Cummins, the old Code of Canon Law, Canon 682 of the 1917 Code of Canon Law. A repetition of the laws of the Church down 2,000 years, codified in 1917. Under the direction because of St. Pius X. He had died a few years before, but he's the one who put together this code. The laity has the right to receive from the clergy the spiritual benefits and especially the necessary means of salvation according to the rules of ecclesiastical discipline. The Canon 682 of the Old Code of Canon Law. The laity has the right to receive from the clergy the spiritual benefits and especially the necessary means of salvation. Here Father Cummins points out, according to ecclesiastical discipline, quo primum still stands. The law of God still stands. The law of the Church still stands. The Latin Mass has never been abrogated, nor has it even been derogated. The Latin Mass is the Mass of the Church. The new Mass does not give spiritual benefits to the sheep. Any questions, any doubts, open your eyes and visit any church, anywhere in the world, where the new Mass is celebrated, and you will see spiritual wickedness. You will see spiritual destruction. The new Mass destroys souls. The new Mass is damaging to the faith. The new Mass is a confusion of faith at best, loss of faith, denial of the sacrifice, and questioning the sacrificial nature of the Mass, and leads souls away from God, is perfectly pleasing to the Protestants and other false religions. It is not of God. It is of no spiritual benefit to the faithful. It is damaging to the faithful and destructive to the faithful. But the faithful have a right to demand what is necessary for salvation, their spiritual benefits. The clergy have the obligation to give to the faithful these spiritual benefits. They are obliged sub gravi, we say in Latin, under the pain of mortal sin, gravely, sub gravi. They are not obliged sub levi, which means under a light obligation. They are obliged sub gravi. Bishops have obligations. Priests have obligations. Popes have obligations. Superiors have obligations. And if they do not fulfill those obligations, the faithful have the right to complain, and the faithful have the right to demand. And if the superiors refuse to fulfill those obligations, they have the right and duty to seek for other priests who will fulfill those obligations. And when those priests fulfill those obligations, they are acting in accord with the divine law. They are acting in accord with ecclesiastical law. They are acting in accord with the law of the Church, and they act with the authority of the Church. One of the errors that has come into play in the last 50 years, the crisis of tradition, the crisis of the Novus Ordo, the crisis of Vatican II and modernism, is that if the faithful request the sacraments, then the priest can come, but he gets his jurisdiction from the faithful. No, that's against the divine teaching. I cannot receive jurisdiction from you. For instance, when I hear confessions, I don't receive jurisdiction from any of you to hear confessions. None of you lay people have the power to give me the power to hear confessions. You neither have the power to give me the power to preach. You don't have the power to give me the power to celebrate Mass. You cannot celebrate Mass, therefore you cannot give the power to celebrate Mass. You cannot preach with the authority of the Church, therefore you cannot give me the power to preach. You cannot hear confessions, therefore you cannot give me the power to hear confessions. Only the Church can give me the power to hear confessions, to preach the faith, and to offer the sacrifice of the Mass for the living and the dead. And the Church does give that power. Canon 209 is also quoted by Father Cummins, that the Church supplies the right to the priest to fulfill the sacraments. And he writes here in a letter, well written, to Bishop Gallagher. He went to the Bishop of Port Pirie with a certain John Cash in 1980, when John was about 15 years old or something. He went to visit the bishop, and then the bishop asked him, write a letter that says, why you're doing this, and I will send the letter to Rome. The letter was never sent to Rome. But in the letter he asked, why are you saying Mass in dioceses without permission? But now a further question. Why do I go into the various dioceses in open defiance of the bishops? The answer to that rests on a principle that overrides every other consideration. Namely, that the genuine traditional faith of Catholics must at all times and at all costs be preserved. See, Father Cummins believed, as my pastor did, the faith was essential for everyone. And it is the most important thing, not only for the priest, but for all. What is the most important thing? The most important consideration. Namely, that the genuine traditional faith of Catholics must at all times and at all costs be preserved. This is the divine law. St. Thomas Aquinas explains, quote, important as the moral virtue of obedience is, yet the theological virtue of faith is even more important. And therefore, any obedience practiced towards bishops at the expense of the faith is really disobedience to God himself, unquote. And St. Thomas Aquinas in Sum Theologica and other places. St. Peter put it in another way when he wrote, we must obey God rather than men, Acts chapter 5. That the faith of Catholics is a very real and serious issue at the present time in 1974. It's a little more, and it's 1980. It is a little more of a serious issue now. That it is a very serious issue at the present time is evidenced by the fact that Catholics are falling away from authentic Catholic beliefs and leaving the Church in great numbers. And this includes many of the clergy. Also, priests and religious are abandoning their vocations as never before. And so applying now the principle enunciated by Christ in the Gospel, by their fruits you shall know them. The obvious conclusion which everyone must surely draw is that grace is not flowing from the modernized Mass, as it used to when Mass was celebrated in the traditional manner. As a matter of fact, I can't see any good fruits that come from the modern Mass, though we do see it a lot in the old Mass, although we see a lot of bad ones. At the same time, how can one be surprised at this when we recall the words of Cardinal Taviani in his letter to Pope Paul VI in September 1969? The Novus Ordo represents both as a whole and in its details a striking departure from the Catholic theology of the Mass as it was formulated in Session 22 of the Council of Trent. So there is a great crisis of faith. Now what do? Why does a priest go around? It is not simply because people request it. People request for us to come. And he explains it very clearly here. The opinion of many priests of the old days, which is no longer believed by priests of the Society of St. Pius X, by the majority of them at least. No longer believed. The continuing letter of Father Cummins. The Catholic Church, in her legislation, gives support to these Catholics, in their just requests for the traditional Mass. And reading again, we already read part of it. In fact, she gives to all Catholics a strict right to it, as expressed in Canon 682 of the Old Code of Canon Law 1917. Quote, the laity has the right to receive from the clergy the spiritual benefits, and especially the necessary means of salvation, according to the rules of ecclesiastical discipline, unquote. Since quo primum has never been abrogated, as explained above, it still forms part of ecclesiastical discipline and still provides us with the traditional Mass of St. Pius V as a spiritual benefit and means of salvation. Furthermore, I feel myself obliged in charity to comply with the requests of these good people to bring them the traditional Mass and sacraments. It is true that the obligation to supply these necessary spiritual helps devolves primarily upon the bishops and pastors by reason of their office ex officio. So it is true that the first obligation to provide you with a Latin Trinity Mass is the Bishop of Port Paris, the local priest in Streaky Bay. The first obligation is for them. If they are fulfilling their obligation and they don't want me to come here, fine, I won't come. They are ex officio, by their office, obliged to teach you the true and holy faith. They are not teaching it. They are obliged to give you the Latin Trinity Mass. They are not giving it. And here, very important, comes up a little bit later by Father Cummins. They are not obliged only to give it to the people that want it. They are obliged to give it to everyone, including the people that hate it. I am not obliged to preach the faith to those people that like the faith, those people that want the faith. I am obliged to preach the faith to everyone. So that when St. Valentine the priest stood in front of the emperor and was being condemned to death, the emperor said, the church, the priests, and Valentine said, you're just an emperor. What do you know? I am a priest of God. I tell you what to worship. I tell you what the truth is. And you, Emperor Decius, if you abandon your pagan priest standing right there, and you abandon your pagan religion, and you come to the true religion and accept the God that I preach, who is the true God, you will have a long reign. But if you do not, you will die most soon. Decius almost converted. So shaken was he by the power of the priest prisoner who stood in front of him, named Valentine. But his priests scared him. Guess what happened shortly after the death of Valentine? Decius died. He was the emperor of Rome from the year 250 AD until the year 250 AD. He didn't make it a year. But he would have had a long reign. And he would have been Constantine the Great had he listened to Valentine. Valentine knew what was right, and not Decius. We are representatives of God. We must preach the truth to emperors. We must preach the truth to the enemies of God. We must preach the truth also to his friends. And Father will point this out in a little bit. So, furthermore, I feel myself charity obliged. It is true, continuing Father Cummins' letter, it is true that the obligation to supply the necessary spiritual helps devolves primarily upon the bishops and pastors by reason of their office ex officio. But if they fail to provide them, then any priest who sees the great danger to the faith and the salvation of Catholics deprived of them, and who is able to do something about it, is obliged. Obliged. The priest does not have an option. He is obliged by charity to do so, ex caritate, and I believe he is gravely obliged, underline gravely. He is gravely obliged because of the eternal issues at stake. That is how I see my role in these difficult times. Father Cummins did not come here to say Mass because he was available that weekend. He did not go to Singapore and say Mass because he was available. He didn't go to New Zealand and open 12 Mass centers because he was available. Because it was something nice to see how the cows and sheep are doing in New Zealand. He did not do that. He says, I am obliged gravely, and this is the obligation of each priest. And I believe the same opinion as Father Cummins. It is not the duty of the priest to find a comfortable parish, to set up his own comfortable parish, and to take care of the few people that will take care of him. Like Bishop Zendaya said in 2014, when he tried to take over one of my parishes, he said, I'll take care of the people that take care of me. That's what he said. I'll take care of the people that take care of me. That's not a shepherd. That's not the duty of the priest. We are obliged to respond to the call of the faithful and to bring the faith wherever, especially those who request it, but not only those who request it, but all of them. Hence, to repeat the words, it is time, it is true, says Father Cummins once again, that the obligation to supply these necessary spiritual helps devolves primarily upon the bishops and pastors by reason of their office ex officio. But if they fail to provide them, and they have failed everywhere in the world, then any priest who sees the great danger of faith and salvation of Catholics deprived of them. See, that's not about whether you feel you need it or not. Many people we meet say, I don't need confession, Father. I don't need to be anointed, Father. I don't need to believe in your religion, Father. Oh, okay. No. You do need confession. You do need my religion, which is the religion of God. You do need the Catholic faith, whether you know it or not. It is my duty to tell you, Hindu, Muslim, Jew, atheist, Protestant, Catholic who's lapsed from the faith, or Catholic that's practicing the faith, you need this faith. You need these sacraments. You are harmed by your false religion. You are harmed by the new Mass, which does not give grace and benefit to souls, but rather leads souls away from God. You are harmed by the Vatican II teaching, whether you like it or not. If you like it, then smiling, you go to hell. If you dislike it, then frowning, you go to hell. But the fact is, in order to go to heaven, you must reject the new Mass teachings. You must reject the false teachings of the Protestants. You must reject all the heresies the Catholic Church rejects. And for the sake of the salvation of your soul, whether you know it or not, believe it or not, like it or not, you must accept the teachings of our Lord Jesus Christ and His Holy Mother, the Church. And I am the ambassador of God and carry the kingdom of God with me. I do not receive authority from a group. We have here earlier, there was a group called the Latin Mass Society in Adelaide. The mother says, well, they decided, or in Melbourne, in the Latin Mass Society in Melbourne, they decided not to be with his parish. The traditional Catholics then moved to a hall nearby for their Sunday Masses. For various reasons, the hall wasn't very satisfactory, and after consultation with some of my parishioners, I decided to transfer back to the Marian Center on Hardware Street, not far from St. Francis Church in the city. About 2/3 of the congregation followed me back. The other third decided to remain with the Latin Mass Society, of which Mr. Michael Foley was the president. They decided to invite Father Crooker, SM, a retired Marist priest whom I met in New Zealand, and who only said the traditional Mass, to come to Melbourne to help them out. He agreed with the proposal and took up residence in Foley's home. After a few years in Melbourne, he returned to New Zealand, where he died. In 1977, we moved to another building. He was the pastor of the parish. 2/3 came with him, 1/3 did not. They invited another priest in, their own little organization. There are many such that did that. They believe that, oh, there's a crisis in the church. We have authority that ourselves, and we will invite the priest in and send the priest out. The priest goes to bring the faith. Everyone needs it. But it is, as Father Cummins says, but especially those who request it. Like St. Paul says, be good to all men, but especially those that are of the household of the faith. And so we must bring the faith to everyone, but especially those that request it. Because you have the right to request it. You have the obligation to request it, not just the right, the obligation to request it. And your pastor, the pastor in Streaky Bay, and your bishop, the Bishop of Port Paris, he is obliged to give you the true faith. He is obliged to give you the Latin Tridentine Mass. He is obliged to hand you what has been handed down by our fathers. Hold fast to the traditions, he says later on in the same letter. Hold fast to the traditions. That's what St. Paul said to us, or St. Peter. Hold fast to the traditions. You don't have a right to take people away from their traditions. The traditions of the Holy Roman Catholic Church, traditions handed us down by the apostles. And so, in any case, briefly it comes to this. So continue the letter a little bit further on. Won't read the whole letter. Father Cummins, 1980. Briefly it comes to this. Charity gravely obliges me to take the true Mass and the sacraments to the faithful, especially those who ask for them. Well, not only those that ask for them, any of the faithful, but especially those who ask for them. And the Church then grants me faculties for hearing confessions when the bishops refuse to do so on account of my traditional convictions. And then, you see a tough guy. There aren't tough guys anymore. They're all whips nowadays. And then what does Father Cummins say to the bishop? My Lord, I would much prefer to go into your diocese of Port Paris with your permission and blessing, rather than to act contrary to your wishes and to rely on the general law of the church for my faculties. My faculties come from the general law of the church. They don't come from the faithful. They come from the church, just like Father Cummins did, just like Father Hannafin did, just like Archbishop Lefebvre did, just like the St. Athanasius, when he went into other dioceses. Though he was a bishop of his diocese, he was not the bishop of the other diocese, and St. Athanasius received his jurisdiction from the church. I have the same jurisdiction of Athanasius, the same jurisdiction of Father Hannafin, my old pastor, if he was alive today, he would be 107 years old. I have the same jurisdiction of all the priests who have had to stand up against wicked authority in order to give the faith and sacraments to the souls in need of them, which are all the souls in the world, and especially those to who request. I would be grateful, therefore, for the sake of those good Catholics in your diocese, whom I visit every month, if you grant the permission to enter your diocese, and faculties for hearing confessions of these people. None of them wish to be at odds with their bishop, but at the same time, they all know well that they cannot compromise their faith and endanger their salvation through a false obedience. This is not only true of the Diocese of Port Pirie, here in Australia, South Australia. It is true in every diocese throughout the entire world. That's why in this Mass we mention the name of the bishop. We mention the name of the bishop in every Mass. And we mention the name of the bishop each diocese every Mass because those bishops truly are our bishops. And they are obliged ex officio in every place where we go. He mentions so many dioceses that he goes into, and he knows their dioceses. He knows the bishop has authority in those dioceses. He knows the bishops are unhappy with him. Give me permission, and the problem will be solved. I met the Bishop of Phoenix, the new Bishop of Phoenix, Bishop Thomas Olmsted, when he became the new Bishop of Phoenix, and he said, my problem with you is that you're not approved. And I responded to Bishop Olmsted, well, if I was the bishop, first thing I would do is approve of myself. But I'm not the bishop, you are. So all you have to do is approve of us, and you don't have a problem anymore. And then he went, he said, it was like nice weather we've been having. My problem with you is you're not approved. Well, you're the bishop. Solve the problem. I'm not the bishop. I have an obligation to say the Mass to these people in South Phoenix. I've got the obligation to give them the sacraments. I've got the obligation to teach them the Holy Roman Catholic faith. You have the same obligation. You are not fulfilling it. If you have a problem with me fulfilling the obligation, which is your obligation, solve the problem. Start preaching the faith. Solve the problem. If you don't approve of me and that's a problem, well then approve of me and the problem is solved. But the fact is, like Father Cummins, I would like to be approved in every diocese in which I visit by the local bishop. I visit these dioceses all throughout the world, wherever the people request. For what purpose? To teach the faith that those bishops are obliged to teach. To say the Mass, those bishops and the priests under them are obliged to say it. Who teach the faith that they are supposed to teach and they are not teaching. When they come back to their senses, when they come back to the fulfillment of their duty, then I won't go in their dioceses to say Mass without their permission. But until such time as they come back to their senses and the light of faith returns to eternal Rome, I go as an ambassador of Christ, as a true son of the local bishop, as a true son of the Holy Father in Rome, as a true son of our Holy Mother, the Church, and our Holy Mother in heaven, to bring Christ, His faith, His sacraments, to souls, to bring them to heaven, to give them the spiritual benefits that they need, that are necessary for salvation, according to the wise law of my Holy Church, Canon 682 of the Old Code of Canon Law. And I follow that law faithfully, as Father Cummins did, as Father Hannafin, my old pastor, did, as Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre did, as Father John Quinn did, and many, many others throughout the whole world, Father Norman Dean in Canada, and so on. So many. And I follow their ways, their footsteps. And St. Athanasius before us. We follow them, and we keep the faith. Let them have the buildings if they want them. We keep the faith. And the faith is what will last until the end of the world. The buildings will crumble. The faith will not. And our Lord Jesus Christ said, not one jot or tittle of my word shall pass. Heaven and earth shall pass, but my word shall not pass. And so long as I, as a Catholic priest, and any other Catholic priest throughout the whole world, stand on the word of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is the truth, we shall not pass. Kingdoms shall rise and kingdoms shall fall, but we shall never pass. We shall remain until the end of time, and our priesthood is so sacred that even when I die, that priesthood remains in me forever. This priesthood that has been given to me and given to all the priests that come before me and all the priests that come after, it is eternal. Can never be taken away by men or by the devil or even by our own selves. And as long as we remain faithful to that priesthood, which comes from God, which comes from our Holy Mother, the Church, and we makes us the true sons of the Blessed Virgin Mary, we are the ones who stood at the foot of the cross with St. John, when our Lord Jesus Christ said, woman, behold thy son. The only way that all men are connected to our Holy Mother, the Blessed Virgin Mary, is through the priest. The priest goes out of the world, and the Mother of God can no longer behold the sons. She can no longer behold the children. She will always behold them. She will always see the children, and they will always be seen through the Son that stands at the foot of the cross. The cross never changes. The truth never dies. The strength of our faith stands in the gospel, which comes from above and not from below. Therefore, we are ready to die for these things. We stand firm for the faith. We receive our jurisdiction from our Holy Church. We are faithful sons of the Society of St. Pius X, faithful son of the diocese, a faithful son of Pope Francis, and a faithful son of our Holy Church, and most importantly, of our Holy Mother in heaven. As long as we remain that way, it's a happy life, a happy eternity, and victory is ours. And the truth and the word shall never pass. Never.
Switch it off.